Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us to this panel on informality and COVID-19 in South Asia. This panel is the final part of a two-day conference on this theme that we had with people from academia in South Asia. Before I introduce the panelists, I first want to give the word to Ilango, who is the Director of Strategy and Operations in South Asia region of the World Bank. And after his opening remarks, I will take over, introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Again, thanks so much for joining us. Ilango, the floor is yours.
Welcome all. Good morning to all in this part of the world, and good afternoon and good evening for those joining from South Asia. This panel is part of South Asia Economic Policy Network Conference on Informality and COVID-19. I'd like to thank Hans and team for organizing it, and I'd like to appreciate and thank all the panelists for joining us this morning as well from different locations. COVID-19 has hit South Asia hard, and it came than other regions, and the worst is still to come. Despite several measures taken by all the countries, domestic transmission has been unbridled. As of today, we have over 5 million cases and 85,000 deaths reported across the region. The pandemic highlights the precarious condition of informal workers and firms in the region and threatens to reverse past progress. South Asia has the highest share of informal employment among all developing regions in the world. More than 80% of the total employment in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan is informal. Many informal workers are among the poorest people in host countries. They have little cash and little access to credit or healthcare. They are among the most vulnerable to shocks. They are also excluded from labor laws and social protection schemes. This means they are hit particularly hard by COVID-19 because support measures do not reach them. Challenges for policymakers responding to COVID-19 in South Asia are immense. In the short term, policymakers need to design relief programs that reach all people, especially the most vulnerable. In the long term, social protection systems must be designed to go beyond targeted poverty relief measures or formal social insurance. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this panel is to hear from civil society, academia, and policymakers about the consequences of the pandemic and the associated economic and social crises for the informal sector in South Asia. The discussion will be structured along the phases of the policy response to the COVID-19 crisis: saving lives, protecting livelihoods, preparing for an economic rebound, and rebuilding better. Hans, do I introduce the panelists, or would you be doing it?
I can do that, Ilango.
Okay, so it's once again, thank you for joining us, and appreciate you supporting the World Bank group in this important work on how to tackle informality. And for me, it's great to see Dr. Ishrat Hussain again, who I know very well from my time in Pakistan. So welcome, Dr. Ishrat Hussain. So back to you, Hans, and sorry for all the dog barking you heard in the background. This is the challenges of working from home. Thank you very much.
No, I actually wanted to thank you, Ilango, for the support that your dog is giving also. It's an important topic, and we need all the support that is possible. So welcome again. What we have learned during the conference till now is that we really cannot understand the impact of COVID-19 in South Asia without understanding the characteristics of informality in South Asia. What we have heard over the last 2 days is that in South Asia, informal workers and small informal companies, they are being hit harder by the current crisis than their formal counterparts. And the reason is that the current crisis really hit hard the service sectors where the informal sector often operates. We also learned that the informal sector in South Asia was hit harder than informal sectors in other parts of the world. And that's an obvious problem because government support in most cases doesn't reach the informal firms, and informal workers are not protected by social insurance. But apart from the current crisis, the stubbornly large informal sector in South Asia is also a long-term challenge, and it requires bold and new initiatives to redress the imbalance, because there is a problem that the informal sector doesn't have access to the same resources as the 10% of the people who are working in the formal sector. Now, our panel will discuss the policies. It's announced as an expert panel, and the term expert panel is actually an understatement in this case. We have four really world-class professionals who during their long careers have developed deep insight into this topic. They have experience both in analytical work and more in the practical policy aspects. So let me introduce them to you. First of all, we have Sabina Faiz Rashid. She is since 2013 Dean of the School of Public Health of Brak University in Bangladesh. She is a researcher specialized in gender, in sexual and reproductive health, in poverty and the rights of marginalized populations in Bangladesh. She advises also the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex in the UK. She has been serving as an international member of the WHO Secretariat, just to name a few of her affiliations. Thanks so much, Sabina, for joining us. Then we also have Reinanna Javvala. She is the national coordinator of the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. She has a long and distinguished career in organizing working women in India into trade unions and cooperatives. She has written extensively about the informal economy. Just to mention two of her latest books on informality. One is The Informal Economy Center Stage, New Structures of Employment. Another one is The Unorganized Sector, Work Security and Social Protection. And then we have Ishrat Hussain. Since 2018, he is the advisor for international reforms and austerity to the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So probably we can ask him about what austerity means under the current circumstances. And he actually walked out of a meeting to join us in this discussion with the Prime Minister. Thanks for doing that. Ishrat, he held key positions in the World Bank for over 2 decades. He was for 5 years governor of the State Bank of Pakistan. The Banker magazine of London declared him as the Central Bank Governor of the Year for Asia in 2005. He had an active academic career, served as Dean and Director of the Institute of Business Administration, the oldest graduate business school in Pakistan. And then last and not least, we have Ravi Kanbur, professor at Cornell University. He also served on the senior staff of the World Bank. He is ranked in the top 0.5% of academic economists in the world. He is the current president of the Society for the Studies of Economic Inequality. So we couldn't wish for a better panel. We have perspectives now from Bangladesh, Sabina, from India, Reinanna, from Pakistan, Ishrat, and perhaps an outside-in view from Ravi, who is currently in New York State, I understand. We will try to have a very freewheeling discussion. You can send questions through a chat function. At the end of the panel, we will try to pose those questions to the panelists and get answers. But let's us first try to set the stage. As Ilango said, we will try to set the stage by looking at what we call in the World Bank the four phases of the policy response to the COVID crisis. The first phase is saving lives, making sure that the pandemic is mitigated. The second phase is protecting livelihoods. The third phase is preparing for an economic rebound. And the fourth phase is rebuilding better, thinking about the longer term future. So let me ask each of the four panelists to address each one of those phases in just a few minutes. Let me begin with Sabina. I want to ask her to tell us something about saving lives in the informal sector in the current crisis. You have thought a lot about providing healthcare to vulnerable people. What can we learn from how the pandemic spread among the people in the informal sector? What are their challenges to socially distance themselves, to access healthcare? And most importantly, what are the policy responses that you are proposing? Sabina, the floor is yours.
So thank you. I wanted to say thank you for. I don't think anyone could have done a better job, so I appreciate it, Hans. I have a couple of key points I want to take a step back. In a pandemic, and we're looking at post-pandemic epidemics, and I really want us to think about a couple of issues, which is the notion of risk and individual determinants of health, unpacking the way we understand health, because that informs interventions and policies, and therein lies the challenge when you're working in diverse contexts, and contexts matter, and across vulnerable groups. And then I want to really talk about, so basically, right now, the way the COVID pandemic has been addressed is a very clinician-led approach. It's biomedical. There's certain guidelines, they're told about isolation, there's testing, wherever there's testing, low or mid levels of testing. But we need to address the structural and social inequalities that many vulnerable populations live in, which makes it very difficult for them to even follow some of the precautionary guidelines. That's one of the key points. One of the other points is that health is, if we keep biomedicalizing health, we're actually talking about human beings. So when we look at Bangladesh, there was a lot of fears about economic mortalities rather than hunger. There was a fear about hunger and job loss rather than dying of COVID. Yes, there was stigma around COVID, but people were worried about jobs. And a whole-scale shutdown led to a lot of fears because many people are daily wage earners. My third point is really the messaging and the policy sector needs to really unpack health. But I think data, as an academic, as a critical medical anthropologist at the School of Public Health, we really need to improve what we count as data. What is evidence? What do we count as data? What counts as legitimate data? Because there's a hierarchy of knowledge and data, and that produces certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of policies, and certain kinds of activities. And we really need to unpack how health is experienced and lived amongst the most vulnerable groups within this pandemic, and as it rolls out, and I can share more later. My final point is any kind of evidence. We need to broaden our perspectives, our framing of those problems, but also look at it in terms of the longer term. And it has to have a community-based engagement and approach. I'm going to leave it for now, and I can expand as we move along to the other speakers. Is that all right?
That's okay, but I immediately have a follow-up question. So let's expand a little bit. My question is, what is your view about lockdown measures? There's a big debate among economists. Many argue that those are not appropriate measures for developing countries because they can't afford it, because you have to protect livelihoods also. There's also an argument that they are not effective in developing countries because in slums, among migrant workers, in refugee camps, you can't implement it. What is your view on lockdown measures?
Yeah, so I mean, this is I wrote about this actually. I talked about a socially just model, and I talked about this. We live in a global world. There's the global and the local, and there's media and there's messaging, and many people, whether they live in slums or in the camps or across society, are tapped into this media. When we adopted the shutdown model, the difference is these were very developed economies with many safety nets. In our context, there's a lot less in terms of that support structure. Two, you have, a system where people had to, people are, it's not that, oh, okay, because they're less well off, they don't deserve shutdown. It's not that. Economic mortality is a reality. People were protesting. There was fights over food. People don't have a lot of money. There's a lot of insecurity. And people started going back to work. Even though there was enforced lockdown, I know because I'm doing research ongoing, people would try and pull a rickshaw, or they'd go knocking at different houses to look for domestic work help, but everything was shut down. So in hindsight, it's much easier to say a lot of, I think to adopt a model that's imposed, we need to look at context. I think context matter. And I think when you look at shutdown, in future, maybe there should be a phase-by-phase approach. If you look at Iran, they were looking at a combination after a while. I know our government by June were looking at opening up factories, allowing people to get back into work while trying to push measures for shutdown, because in many places, you can't afford masks, you can't afford soap, and you need to eat. So I also think that this universal preparedness and accountability needs to understand this diverse context. In many, many other countries, it was the aging. Our aging population is much less in Bangladesh, right? I'm not saying that we're not at risk, but I do think there needs to be more critical reflection on the social and other aspects and dimensions. It cannot just be a biomedical adopt and paste a model and then say, let's see what happens. Because I think there's a lot of other fallouts, economic, the social, and there's real deprivations and a lot of mental and emotional distress. That would be my response.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's turn to Reinanna and ask you to, in a few minutes, give your perspective on protecting livelihoods. We have all seen the large groups of domestic migrants in India who lost their job in the cities, went back to rural areas. What is your experience? What can we learn from this crisis? What are your policy proposals? Reinanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans. And thank you also for inviting me to this panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say. I would like to divide it into three parts. The lockdown itself, where nobody was allowed to work. The opening, which has been the last few months, and then what do we look for in the future? So the lockdown itself, I think what we really need to emphasize is the immense suffering that people had. In the first couple of months in India, food really did become a problem. There was widespread hunger. But by the third month, because the government's food transfers were working, that sort of eased somewhat. Of course, there was no cash in the lockdown. 90% of people, according to our surveys, had no work. As things began opening up, we had agriculture rebounded the fastest. So the informal in agriculture, connected to agriculture, did rebound. Though I would like to point out that women farmers, women connected to agriculture were the more disadvantaged because they use public transport to transport their vegetables and goods and seeds and so on. And public transport in most places is still closed. In the urban areas, we see that as things are opening, many things are not working. Manufacturing is still limping along. Labor, construction, of course, construction, because it's the monsoon, is also low right now. So all the construction workers don't have work. Manufacturing, as I said, has barely opened out. In the factories, it's still on. And all ancillaries are very slowly opening. Street vendors, markets are not really opened. The street markets, for example. And in our last survey just a few days ago, we found that 48% of street vendors are still not working. Domestic workers, again, people do not want them in their houses. And 55% have joined, but the rest have not joined. The micro enterprises is really a very big area, all types of micro enterprises, but 80% have not been able to work for 3 months. And now maybe about 50% have started, but with very, very low earnings. So it's rather a dismal situation, even as we are opening up. What worked? The rations, giving out rations. Wherever there was a possibility of giving cash transfers, it did work. But I think what we really need to see is the pandemic and the lockdown has really opened up, has shown us the structural problems that exist. And as you said, the informal sector is huge in South Asia and India too. And I'd like to mention at least 3 things there. One is there is no identification of people who work in the informal sector. So even if the government had wanted to reach relief, had wanted to reach cash transfers, they weren't able to do so because they were unidentified. Migrants especially, I'm sure the government would have been keen to reach cash transfers to them, but they could not identify them. And the second is micro enterprises, which are 110 million people in India work in micro enterprises. And with all the measures that are, the loan measures that the government is doing, none of that is really reaching micro enterprises. It may be reaching the larger enterprises. And finally, I think what's extremely important in a social protection measure is to have some way in which we can reach cash transfers to these millions of people. And we don't have that now. So I think that's the direction in which we need to go.
Thanks a lot. That means a more universal social protection system. Would you even think about a universal basic income, or that goes too far?
Well, a lot of experiments on the basic income. And what we found we did a big experiment in one of the states with about 20,000 people. And what we did find is that of all the different types of social protection, a cash transfer is in a way the most effective because it gives a lot of choice to the person. So I would say basic income, yes. The question is how universal, and there I would stop at a certain point. Actually, the economic survey 2 years ago had a good chapter on basic income in India and talked about a quasi-universal basic income. So I think we would go in that direction. I would also go in the direction of small loans to micro enterprises. So those are the 2 things that I think would be very important.
Thank you so much. And let me turn to Ishrat now on the topic of the potential of South Asia to rebound the economy once the pandemic is under control. Yesterday, we had a presentation from the Lahore School of Economics showing that especially small and micro enterprises are running arrears now. And that can really jeopardize their ability to rebound once the pandemic is under control. You have been governor of the central bank. What is your view? Can this problem be solved by creating more credit? The micro financial credit companies, they have a problem now. There's not really a financial infrastructure in the informal sector. You're also advising the government on fiscal policies. What is the role of fiscal policies in the rebound? What can be done? What is your view? A few minutes for you, Ishrat.
We had a big advantage, which was that we had in 2010 carried out a national socioeconomic survey of all the poor families. And we had this cash transfer program, Benazir Income Report, which has a database of more than 12 million families. And we classified them according to the poverty mean scorecard. So the people who are getting the cash transfer even before this particular pandemic were 5.2 million families. So what the government did was to increase the poverty scorecard to cover up to 24 rather than 16. So in all, we got another 4 million households. So totally, we had almost 9 million households which were targeted poor according to the census and survey results. And each one of them had a unique identifier. So we were able to disperse cash transfers for supporting pandemic of $75 to each household in lump sum. Now that was a major intervention as far as the poor, and even above those were some cash relief. Then the question arose about the daily wage workers, and they had no particular, means of data which we could use it. So we carried out an SMS-based survey and said that you can use your ID cards, numbers, and give us your background where you were working. And then we use our national data identification base and use the data analytics to filter out people who were not eligible for cash transfer. So we were able to increase from 9 million households to 16 million households. And so far, this has been the single largest transfer of funds to the poor, to the daily wage workers, to the micro enterprises, and this has gone to almost $1.5 billion in the last 3 months. So that is a large infusion in order to overcome the poorest and also the informal sector. The second good feature was that the pandemic coincided with our agriculture harvesting season and the sowing season for the next crops. And most of the informal workers, as you know, are in our rural areas. So they were deployed for the agriculture, and agriculture has done well as compared to the non-agriculture sector in the economy. So they were gainfully employed, and they got the wages by the landlords and by their own, small plots of land. The third element of this was a fiscal stimulus package, whereby both the central bank, through the banking restructuring of the loans, allowed 1 year deferred payments to the banks, by the banks to their borrowers and the businesses, if they are able to demonstrate that they will retain their workers. And top of that, we had a bank loan scheme for those industrial units and for those small enterprises who committed to keep the $750 million are dispersed during the last 4 months through these fiscal stimulus package
I seem to have lost my internet connection.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hans, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. I said that we have lifted the lockdown, which was a smart lockdown, selective, based on the track, trace, and quarantine technology which we use. And therefore, the rebound has started taking place. And there are revenue collection has gone up, exports have picked up, index of large-scale manufacturing has picked up. But what I'm still worried about is whether we are going to have the second wave or not, because a lot of countries like Korea, Spain have gone through successful transition, and then they have gone back to the second wave. So we are keeping the standard operating, procedures, the masks, the hand wash, and all those, but we are still keeping our fingers crossed whether we will not go through a second wave. That is our experience in Pakistan.
Thanks so much, Israt. If you can mute now, that would be helpful. So actually, a relatively optimistic view on the economic response and the potential to rebound. Perhaps later in the discussion, we can come back to that. But I want to turn now to Ravi and talk about what we all like to talk about: rebuilding better, the long term. We all see these visions of a more sustainable economy, a more inclusive economy. We see opportunities to make the economies greener. What is your view there? And actually, there are questions already coming in through the chat. And one question is exactly on this topic. What are the three top priorities for the long run? Either political, economic, social, or any you want, if you want to rebuild better. What's your view there, Ravi?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hans, and thanks to the panelists. Speaking last, of course, everything important has already been said, so I'll probably be repeating a few things that people have said. But also, although I was actually a successor to Ishrat Hussain as Chief Economist of Africa, let me put on my sort of nerdy academic hat for this panel and raise a few questions from that point of view, and then I'll come back to the question that was raised. So I just want to pick up 2 points. One is this issue of the stability of informality in South Asia in general, that however you measure it, basically the intensity of informality in terms of fraction of workers, whatever it is, has actually not changed very much over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think that's an important phenomenon, and we should try to understand why that is the case, as reflecting some structural features of these economies. The point is that the 30 years before that, actually informality did fall. And in a cross-country type, in a cross-sectional type thing, informality is lower in richer countries and so on. So what's going on in this last 20, 25 years, I think is something that we as analysts should be thinking about. Couple of sort of responses. One is a sort of the usual debate on regulation and so on, and the usual suspects say, well, of course, it's all to do with regulation. If regulation was because regulation, enterprises are smaller than they otherwise would want to be, et cetera, and that's what explains the stability of informality. I'm not fully convinced with that by that argument, because if anything, regulation in the last 20 years or so has actually decreased, not increased, certainly in terms of effective regulation. So I think that's a debate that we should be having, as to whether that is the explanation. Because if that's the explanation, then the policy response seems to be reasonably clear in that. But another type of view, which I haven't seen explored as much, which perhaps economists could, is technology has changed. Technology has been changing in the last 20, 25, 30 years. And maybe the viable and optimal size of enterprise has actually gone down in the last 20, 25 years. You no longer need to be so big to fully reap the economies of scale and so on, so because the nature of technology has changed. Well, if that's the case, and suppose the optimal size, just for the sake of argument, the optimal size of enterprise is now 8 workers, whereas the definition of informality that is used, for example, in the Indian manufacturing sector is less than 10 workers. Okay, I mean, there will be a natural tendency for these numbers to go up and to stay the same. So that's a sort of analysis that I think we should be doing to understand this stability of informality as measured. So that's one and technical point that I want to make. The second point is related to shocks in social protection. I think, as Reinanna said, I believe that this COVID shock really reveals the structural features of the system. And the last time we had this sort of discussion that I was involved with in a significant way was actually at the time of the financial crisis of 2008-9, when again there was a tremendous sort of shortfall in revenue, resources, et cetera, and poverty rates increased and so on. And governments and the World Bank and others showed how good they were by moving quickly to address this sort of exercise. And in a way, my point at the time and my point now is that this is all very good. Of course, there's a clear and present danger, and we should be moving and doing our best, etc. But there's going to be a crisis like this in the next 5 years. Just as 10 years ago it could have been predicted, there's going to be some form of crisis of this type. We don't know where it's going to hit, we don't know how it's going to hit, but it is going to come. So we should be assessing our social protection systems as they are, imagining how they would respond to crises of different types, to shocks of different types. It could be a trade shock, it could be a this shock, it could be a that shock. Now, given that we can't predict exactly where it's going to be, how the duration, etc., then there's a natural tendency, Hans, to argue for more universal systems, because they'll be present no matter what happens, and they will move. And I think that's a sort of a mind picture we should keep in our minds. But of course, in reality on the ground is that we have a myriad set of systems on the ground. We are where we are. And actually each crisis lays down a new sediment of systems, which then don't disappear after the crisis. And we'll continue to have some of these schemes that have been put forward in South Asian countries in the years to come. So my suggestion was that we should do a social protection assessment program, rather like the financial sector assessment program. Well, what does a financial sector assessment program do? It imagines different crises. It imagines what would happen if this firm went bust, if that happened, if the tourist sector fell, etc. What are the weaknesses? What are the vulnerabilities of the financial system as a result of this? So I'm sort of thinking that one would do this sort of a simulation exercise looking ahead 5 years, 7 years. Imagine different types of likely crises. And actually the machinery to do that is already there, because in fact, your team, Hans, is doing this. They're already doing simulation exercises on what would happen this way, that way, okay? And in fact, they're simulating the impact of the new measures and so on. So that's a broad analytical point that I would make in terms of a social protection assessment program to be put in place for the next crisis, whatever that is, rather than in 3 years' time, then chasing our tails to address that. The final point, analytical point I would make, and actually I made this in my comments on earlier, is this connection between residential proximity and work proximity. I think what COVID has laid bare is obviously the impact. It depends very much on work proximity, and that's been the analysis that we've seen done. But of course, residential proximity is also important in terms of transmission of infectious diseases, and the connection between informal housing, between slums, between health conditions in those, and work proximity, I think, is an important thing for us to investigate, and that's an analytical question for the future and a policy question for the future, which this COVID crisis throws up. So those are the points that I was going to. Those are the broad sort of analytical, academic type points that I was going to make. Thank you.
So if I can translate these analytical points into your view of the longer term future, then that would be a future where small, informal, flexible enterprises can thrive using the new technology. So policies should encourage that and facilitate that. It would be a future where you have a broader set of social protection, social insurance measures that are more resilient and can cope with different kinds of of crises, and a future perhaps where you address the problem of the informal housing, the slums, and the problem that people experience in their residential area. That's the kind of future that you see coming out of
yes, yes, very much so. And in a sense, I'm sure Reinanna would make this point also, is that this debate which particularly in India, but also in other South Asian countries, we seem to have got caught up in terms of regulation of the labor market and so on, so forth. I mean, as an economist, I can see those points, but I think in a way that could well be secondary to our concerns. The real issue is how to invest and how to bring up the productivity of those enterprises, which are actually 1-person or 2-person enterprises. What happens at the margin of 10, 12, 13, 14 may have been important 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when that was the route to growth and so on. But with the change of technology, that may no longer be the route. And in fact, we're seeing that those sorts of issues in many other countries. So I think, yes, emphasizing that point also. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. In a second round, I would actually try to link the short-term crisis response and the relief efforts to that longer-term prospects of building better. There are basically two views there. One view argues that it's all nice to talk about, but in a crisis you can't afford it. When your house is on fire, you call a fire fighter. You're not calling an architect to design a nicer home for the future. There is another view that basically argues never waste a good crisis, because now suddenly you have opportunities to rebuild. It is clear at the moment that, for example, the tail end risks that we often talk about are not taken seriously, should be taken seriously. We have experiences now that you can have cleaner air and cleaner water, so there are opportunities to think in a more greener way about the future. The crisis has really shown the harsh reality of inequality, the deep social divides. So there's no alternative than starting to address those social divides in the longer term future, because otherwise that will be really a threat to sustainable development. So let me ask all four of you where you come out. You can't afford hiring an architect now, or never waste a good crisis. Sabina, what's your view?
I was just going to draw on all the comments by the other. Is that I think what Dr. Ravi mentioned is that, you know, we're talking about the pandemic and all this crisis, and I've been working in Bangladesh since '93, and the poor and the ones in the informal sector are always in crisis. If it's not the famine, it's the floods, they've lost their job, the factories burned down. So really, their lives are fluid. It's sort of up and down. And we have a very siloed approach in health and development. And the challenge with health is it's a very biomedical model. We don't look at to food sanitation. Just giving insurance and giving better loans is not going to result in helping a sustained engagement with the underlying structural issues that affect these populations. And this pandemic, there could be a famine, there could be an earthquake. You'll have similar issues going on. I think the sooner we realize in a policy spectrum of how do we work across sectors and really look at an engagement, not through one approach, but many different approaches. And I think that's what others are saying in some ways, which means actually reframing the way health, which is so clinical, to a broader perspective, the social, the economic, the political, because you have disrupted social networks in the informal sector. It's not like life was easier before the pandemic, but right now it's even more fragmented, even more fragile. My first point. So basic rights, we have to go back to the fundamentals. We really want to look at sort of bad stuff and the around cash transfers that are left out, adolescents who don't get ID cards, beggars, the invisible, the widows, etc. My second point is that we also, if we want to look at these fault lines, what about global or local accountability? So there was issues around garment industries and orders being canceled. Where is those sorts of global accountabilities where we need to have these conversations where, be it pandemics, be it epidemics, be it crisis, we need to look at some ways of how do we come together in spaces like this, into all of that. If we really engage with communities themselves, data, still conventional model to collect research. If you look at the rollout of the pandemic, if you map people from March till now September, and some of my colleagues, when they were sharing what was going on with the hunger and something out to work, it's going to unfold in many different ways. And vulnerabilities are going to go up and down. It's going to differ. And different groups, because they're heterogeneous communities. They're not homogeneous. We like to lump all the poor, remote, urban, rural. It's quite diverse. I would suggest if you want to have evidence-based policies to inform programs and interventions, there has to be engagement with the communities, but also a multidisciplinary approach. You cannot just have, a certain kinds of disciplines, epidemiologists, statisticians, or economists. You have to have sociologists and anthropologists working together. Otherwise, we need this comprehensive picture. And as you said, despite it being a crisis and it's created so much despair, these are opportunities to come together. Academically, research-wise, our critical thinking. And this will have an influence on policies. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of the same old, but under a different label. That's what I would like to add. Thank you.
No, thank you. You come clearly out on one side. Just crisis response is not good enough. That's Band-Aids. And you have to think about the more structural underlying causes and start to address that also. Reinanna, would you agree with that? Is this the time to start thinking about bold structural reforms, or is this actually not the time for it because there's so much relief efforts to be done?
No, absolutely. One has to think of the broad structural reforms. And I think this is the time. What did you say? Don't waste a good crisis. This is the time where the structural faults are actually showing through. And therefore, this is the time where you can talk about it. And I would like to, I'm glad that Ravi laid out a number of different ideas, all dealing with the kind of structures we have. And I'd like to make 3 points, picking up from what Ravi said. The first was looking at the social protection scenarios when there are crises. And I think that's a very important thing to do. In India, we have multiple schemes, which are all supposed to lead to some form of social protection. For example, in a study we did, we found that in one village, there were 326 schemes which were supposed to protect people and remove poverty, but it was a very poor village. Another example I'd like to give is we have the Rural Employment Scheme. And during this time, the Rural Employment Scheme has really been ramped up to protect the migrants who've come back to rural areas and help them get some income. But another study I just saw says that only 9% of the migrants actually are getting work from this Rural Employment Scheme. So the thing, at least for India, is that we just have a huge multiplicity of schemes. And which of these schemes really can protect during such crises? And I think that study really needs to be done and some hard decisions taken. The second point I wanted to make was, I'm glad you raised the point about the informal housing and the kind of, not so much about the work and the informal housing. And I think Sina also talked about it, but why would the pandemic spread more in the informal settlements? really the main reason is the lack of water and sanitation and cleanliness. And there is no reason for that to happen. And the reason it happens is because in all our countries, the policy is that if you're not quote unquote legal, or the land you're staying on is not legal, then you do not automatically get access to water and sanitation. And so the city is denying you water and sanitation, although that makes the whole city worse. And so that's a policy that really can be addressed, changed. And again, in this pandemic, I think it has become very clear that water and sanitation is very important. And the third type of policy that can be changed is the financial financial inclusion of micro enterprises. And I think in all our countries, what we're seeing is there is a big gap in the financial system. So the banks lend to larger enterprises. Microcredit reaches very small loans for consumption or for very small businesses, and usually it's consumption. The micro enterprises, there is no system at all. So I think that's another gap that has come to the fore or is emerging as the crisis takes on. So those were some of the points I wanted to make.
Thank you so much. So let's go to Israt for that same question. And let me ask it in this way. In all your meetings with the government, how much time is spent on the relief efforts that you described in your first interventions, all the support measures to households and companies, and how much time at the moment is spent on broader and bolder structural reforms to set the stage for the future? I think you're muted, Israt.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. We were fortunate that we had a very strong institution targeting the poor. And we had a database which was pretty robust, thanks to all the efforts done by the donor agencies and by the government. So that was something which saved us. So I believe that unless you have institutions, systems, data in place, these relief measures would have failed completely. So that's my belief. Now I come to, despite this, we had a coordination failure because Pakistan has a very much federal structure where the provinces are much more affluent as far as the public resources are concerned, and also the administrative and legal authority. So there was a breakdown between the federal government and the provincial governments in terms of the delivery of these packages also. So they have come up with a new model, which is National Coordination Committee, to which the provinces and the federal government sit together and agree on a plan of action, which will be carried out by everyone according to the respective. And this model is now being applied to SMEs, for example, that there are fragmented responsibilities and you don't have one platform in which the structural reforms can take place. So this pandemic has given us some lessons as to how we can overcome our difficult coordination problems. My third point is that despite this coordination mechanism, I believe that if we had strong local government systems where the private sector, the communities, the local officials, and the NGOs work together in order to reach out to the poor because they have a much better knowledge of the local conditions, our targeting and our efficiency would have been much greater than what has happened now from this centralized system. So I totally am, and my responsibility is structural reforms. So I spend more time on spending time on structural reforms and learning from our failures and learning from our experience and using this experience in order to refine and strengthen the future institutional framework, not only for relief and delivery, but for packaging all the services and all the efforts the government is making to reach out to the targeted population. That is our effort. And this pandemic has given us a database of the daily wage workers, which will help us in future in order to reach them out.
Thanks a lot. And so going to Ravi, also the question, can we afford structural reforms at the moment? And let me bring in two questions I'm seeing in the chat that could be part of these longer term reforms. Sabina mentioned accountability, and there was actually a question on that also. What needs to be done to increase government accountability in the relief measures? There's another question on what are the benefits of being formal, and have these benefits increased over the last 2 decades? And so let me translate that. Is the informal sector small because of insider outsider policies? The informal sector has created a very comfortable position with lots of benefits, political connections, and should a longer term strategy address also the formal sector and reform the formal sector? So accountability and the formal sector, do we need reforms in the longer run there also?
Good. Well, I'll come to those questions in a minute. Let me just respond to your thing about the when your house is on fire and so on. So the sort of view that I take is, obviously in the crisis, you have to address the crisis. You can't sort of be thinking about the placement of the fire extinguishers and so on whether the alarm systems, when you're actually putting out the fire. But the placement of the fire extinguishers was wrong, and the alarm system wasn't working and so on is obviously brought to the fore by the fact that there's a fire. My real problem is that once the fire is gone, as was the case when the financial crisis passed, we then forget about those issues or those things that were highlighted by the crisis. So in fact, my comments were related to what happens in 2 years from now, and whether we'll be back to the same old. That was my point. Now about the formal sector and so on and so forth, and this is of course a huge debate, and one can see it's also quite a political debate. And so on. There's the cushiness of the formal sector and so on. And of course there is a certain truth to that, and no question about it. My question is, how important is that relative to the question of whether one should be investing in the 1-person, 2-person enterprise? Okay, that's the question. If we think of having both financial capital and political capital, you have a certain amount of political capital you want to use. Do you want to use that to address the issues of trade union power or whatever it is just now? Or do you want to use that to actually talk about financial inclusion at the other end? And also you have a whatever it is, $100 million or whatever. How would you use that? What is the best use of those financial resources? And my own instinct is that, again, as an economist, I talk about those things a lot, but the priority, I think, is probably not that. Is not that just now, and certainly the crisis reveals that is not going to be priority from a structural point of view. So that would be my thing. And the second point, the accountability point, is of course again what the rush to get this money out, which again is a perfectly reasonable desire, reveals are the accountability issues, which then we should be thinking about 2 years down after the crisis has passed. There will be, of course, there'll be more leakages the more you try to push through the pipes. There's no question about that. And this will be discussed and talked about. But again, the 2 years down the road, we look back on that and say these are the gaps we have to plug. Is the question, not saying, well, there are so many leakages we shouldn't do anything about it now. That would be my sort of accountability type of response.
Thanks. On the accountability, yesterday Shanta Devarajan was at the conference also, and he mentioned the lack of trust in government in South Asia, and as we see the social divides deepening, as we see the reality of the inequality in the current crisis, how do you see that the trust in governments and how that might threat longer term development? Is it social unrest that could be a major danger in the longer run for sustainable growth?
Yeah. So again, there are these sort of there's been a discussion, in fact, because what in a way what the crisis has done is that, and actually I have a question for Ishrat at the end of my comments here, which is more macroeconomic question. So remind me to ask him that question. So the debate it's been, all those people who were thinking, the government should stay where it is, it shouldn't expand, it should whatever, let the private sector do this and so on. Okay, well we're all big government people now, okay, because we realize that it's despite all its problems, despite all its issues, and again we should be talking about that nonstop. It is actually the state which has stepped in to do these things, which has expanded these things and so on. Again, problematic, no question about it. There are all sorts of issues and so on. But who do you think could have done this? And then suppose 10 years ago we had completely defanged the state, we had completely neutered the state, then what would we have done now? Okay. So I think those sorts of debates are ongoing, but it's very interesting how even those, especially those who 5 years ago, 7 years ago, were saying the state is too big, as the economist saying goes, we're all Keynesians in a foxhole. Okay, we're all Keynesians when it comes to the crisis. So actually, that's my question for Ishrat. I don't know if Ishrat is still online. So Ishrat, both as a former World Bank wala, but also as a central bank governor, what's your view on the whole deficit thing? Okay, do deficits not matter at all now, or is it that again it's a question of let's get this fire out and then we'll think about it? And because of course deficits are rising like crazy, and if we'd seen these numbers 5 years ago, the response would have been predictable from some quarters. So what say you to that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ishrat, because austerity is actually in the title that you have as an advisor also.
Yeah. I've abandoned that title. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I've abandoned that title since March 2020. So I'm no longer a believer in austerity for the last 6 months. Now, answering Ravi's question, it depends on what your initial conditions are. Pakistan, unfortunately, is in a bad situation as far as the external debt, domestic debt, and total debt is concerned. We have already crossed 100% of GDP. Therefore, unless we are able to finance our twin deficits through non-debt creating inflows, both domestically and from the external investors, for example, we would have an unsustainable debt situation. And therefore, our credit rating, our credit worthiness, our access to private capital would all be impaired and will be affected. So we have to strike a balance. Here, we have cut down on the new recruitments, new asset formation, acquisition by the government and government bodies to free up the money in order to finance these targeted interventions to help the poor. And this is the only item where our disbursements have actually more than doubled. While the rest expenditures have been frozen, we have taken a very deliberate decision that pro-poor expenditures have to be increased, not only due to pandemic, but also because of the growing inequality in access to services. So water supply, sanitation, solid waste disposal and others are becoming a major problem. And recently, the federal government and the Sindh government have created a large investment program for the next 3 years for Karachi, which is the financial and industrial capital, because there was no water, the sewerage was bad, the storm drains during the rains had choked up and flooded, and there was electricity breakdown. So this is the prioritization and reallocation of expenditure rather than reducing the deficit, because our initial conditions are not very favorable. But if you have low debt to GDP ratio, then I would not care for the deficits in these times of difficulties. And I'll open up the fiscal as well as the monetary toolbox in order to reach out to those people.
Thanks a lot. At the same time, we know that there is, if you can mute, please, Israt. At the same time, you showed that there is a tension between short-term relief and the longer-term policies, because the short-term relief expenditure comes at a cost of longer-term investment projects that are probably needed to rebuild better also. But I actually want to ask all four of you another question. And again, there you can choose sides. We have talked quite a bit about the digital technologies and how that changes the economy and societies. And so there's a very positive view that it's transformational. It can address the social divides in the sense that it can make education available in rural areas. It can provide easier access to healthcare. It's much easier to implement broader social protection, and it can give small enterprises access to markets, even access to international markets. So that's one view, a really positive, transformational technology that can improve the conditions in the informal sector. The other view is that the digital technologies will only create another divide, a digital divide, where it is the educated people that are benefiting a lot. As you're seeing now, certain jobs, people can still work from home. Well, in other jobs, you lose your job. So what is your view of the impact of digital technology? Will it reduce inequality and inequality of opportunity, or will it create a new divides? Sabina, let's start with you. I'm not sure whether you're thinking or you're just...
I don't think it's either or. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we hear you. We hear you. Yeah.
Hang on. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Hello? Yeah, so I was going to say, I don't think it's either or. We shouldn't dismiss a technology if it creates opportunities for some groups. I think what we need to be always critically reflective is digital technology cannot also replace some basics. I think what I found really problematic over the years when I see the development discourses, you know, you've got this siloed approach and one thing becomes the panacea of everything. Microcredit, panacea, panacea. It doesn't work like that. There are groups who are not going to have the ability to access digital technology. Secondly, they may not work that well for them. If you look at the mobile financial transfers, it worked well because it cut out where it worked, if it was done properly. It cut out middlemen, it cut out politics, it cut out all the others, you know, who, depending on if the lists were appropriate and they have the numbers, it helped, right? Where it worked. But then there's remote areas. There's places where if you look at some of this education where it's gone online, some of the better off schools that have the ability, the broadband, the internet services in certain areas of villages, they may not be there. So I think my question to all of us is that we have a tendency to jump on a bandwagon and we don't question it. And I've seen that living and working in many, I mean, in Bangladesh, I see it, where we jump and we get very excited and there's no questions asked. And then we do a bunch of surveys and that gives us some information of numbers and prevalence. I think we really need to look at some of these, I keep saying, you know, poverty, heterogeneity, contextual realities matter, ground realities matter. So if we're trying to implement different ways of resolving, let's say, cash transfers, let's say we're looking at education, let's say we're looking at other opportunities, we really need evidence. We need to spend time seeing who it helps, who's left out, and how does it impact on those who don't actually have an opportunity or access to those technologies. And we need a human touch. We need to actually go back to some basics. I think we need to address some basics. And I'm being a bit bold by saying this. We jump to new kinds of ways of managing crisis. New ways are helpful, but sometimes it's just good to look at what were the basics done in the past that worked well. Why can't we assess some of that worked well? I look at Bangladesh, where we had disasters and floods, and local villages and communities had databases. They had systems in place. So over reliance on these sort of, I would be like, it's not either or. We just need to move forward cautiously, not to keep jumping on it and saying, now that's going to resolve everything. That's my honest opinion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I must admit, I'm one of the persons who are seeing the transformational opportunities of digital economies, including for the poorer people. But thanks so much for asking these questions. And so let's
sorry,
yeah.
Just to say, to have access, give them that opportunity where they have access, they can afford it, they can do it, yes, but they don't have the opportunities. It's like you offer something and then people just don't have the money or the opportunities or the access. Then what? You have a divide, right? And if you have the opportunities, yes, that's great.
Yeah, I recall when I was in Colombo, for example, you see the tuk-tuk drivers. They're often people from rural areas who temporarily go to the city to earn some money. They rent a tuk-tuk, but at the same time, they have a smartphone and you can, like an Uber service, you can ask for their services. So you see slowly that it's becoming integrated. The same is true for mobile payment systems.
I mean, there's lots of opportunities. I mean,
Yeah.
Hans, there's lots of opportunities. I just think if we're trying to have an equitable approach, a socially just model, then we need to look at those who may miss out or the invisible groups. That's all.
Okay, so let's ask Reinanna about the equity. Reinanna, you have thought a lot about the divide between rural areas and urban areas. How do you see the digital technologies? Will that reduce the divide or only increase it?
Actually, before I get to that, if you don't mind, to take up the question that you posed on the formal informal. I think somebody asked that question in the chat. And I would like to clarify what we mean by informal. So there is the informal sector enterprises, those micro enterprises and small enterprises we're talking about. But then we also have the informal workers. So workers who work in informal conditions. And they are both those workers who work in the informal sector enterprises, but there's a huge army of workers who actually work in formal enterprises, but have got quote unquote informalist in that they have no social security, no no proper negotiating power, and mostly work, the formal sector sort of contracts out labor. And I think that particular section, we've talked about informal sector enterprises and what can be done with them, but that particular cohort of workers who are either directly or through contractors indirectly connected to the formal sector, that has really grown. As labor regulation decreased, that has grown hugely. And that is the sector those are the migrants that you saw in India going back home because they had no protection at all. So I think we really need to, when we talk about formal and informal, we need to look at both those, the enterprises, but the much larger number of workers. So I did want to make that point. And now about the digital technology, I think it's a force. It's coming, it's expanding, it's going to expand. We can't say, It's like holding back the waves. You can't say, go back, go back. You can't. Of course, it has changed many systems. When I talked about social protection and cash transfers, then it has only become possible because of direct transfers, digital transfers, and the technology that is connected with it. When we talked about connecting communities, that's only become possible because of mobile phones. There is, however, something that is happening with digital technology. Oh, yes, and I should say one more thing, which is during the COVID crisis, it's digital technology, not only among the well-off or the well-resourced, but also among the poor, which has helped them reach a lot of the relief. But what we do see is that digital technology, it is creating, or it's making worse some of the inequalities. And especially I'd like to say about the male-female inequality, because now there are no real proper studies, lots of figures around, but what I understand from many of these figures is that women access digital technology about 50% as men do. So, which means that women, for various reasons, some of it social, some of it to do with literacy, are actually being left behind. And in a country like ours, where the women's labor force participation rate is already so low, and where digital technology has become more important in work, this inequality is going to make it worse for women. So I actually would like to endorse Sabina's points, which is to say that we do need to identify where the inequalities are, who's getting left behind, and work out systems by which these people who are getting left behind, and I was saying women, they, through digital literacy programs, through actually cheaper smartphones actually given to them under various schemes, things like that would reduce the inequality. But we have to have programs which actually address those inequalities.
Thanks a lot. So let's turn to Israt, also on the digital technologies, and let me bring in a question that I'm seeing coming in on the chat now also. And that question is, the pace of job creation is too slow. What can be done to structurally increase the job creation? So let's link that to digital technologies. What do you see? Does it create more jobs or does it destroy jobs?
Let me say that there were some unintended consequences of the COVID-19. When the schools were closed and most of the teaching was done through teleeducation, and we discovered that there are a lot of areas which have poor infrastructure where the broadband could not be reached. There were no optic fibers. There was no last mile. So this has led now to a very aggressive policy response that billions of rupees out of the Universal Service Fund have been allocated to reach out to these underserved areas where there will be connection with the rest of the country. So to me, this was an unintended consequence of the COVID-19 that we have moved in the digital space for those who were left behind. So same was happening on the SMS, because we were making all these invitations from the daily wage workers, informal workers through the SMS. Now, the people who didn't have the mobile phones, they used their friends or their families in order to respond, because they had to give their computerized national identity card number, and they couldn't do it unless they were communicating through SMS. So even the phone purchases, the small phone purchases have already gone up. So this was the result. So I totally tend to agree with your hypothesis that there will be not an inequity as far as the digital technologies are concerned, but there will be a cementing of the inequities over time because people have become aware of the powerful benefits of the digital technology. Now, coming to job creation, this debate is unsettled. There are a lot of people who are saying, well, the robotics and artificial intelligence and everything else will take over human jobs. But the studies which I have seen from very responsible academic and non-academic institutions, that they are looking for people who are good at social skills, at interpersonal skills, at team buildings, at collaborative work, at problem solving among individuals. So the demand is not for technical skills as much as it is for the social skills. Therefore, there will be a shift in the job creation from what we always emphasize, that you acquire professional and technical knowledge, which is essential, but also you combine them with the social skills. So the digital space will not be able to replace those skills. That is the future job creation, and we have to invest in those individuals. Our schools and colleges do not prepare us at all for the social skills. So our curriculum, our pedagogical tools, as well as our assessment methods will have to be modified in order to incorporate the future demands of the job creation in the global economy. I'm not talking only in South Asian economies, but the global economies. The aging population in Japan, even in China after a while, in the European Union and the US would require the human trained, technical, as well as social skilled people who will do the job in these labor scarce markets. And we have to prepare our population, because the younger population in South Asia with those set of skills.
Okay, Ravi, overhyping the digital technologies, or are they really transformational?
So let me just make 3 quick points. Firstly, I agree with Reinanna that the definition of informality is very important to be precise about what exactly it is, particularly because sometimes when we use the word informality, the person is talking about informality of type A, and the person who's listening is hearing informality of type B. Okay, so I think we have to be quite precise about this, certainly in a technical context, but actually it also has in a policy discourse as well. My second point is that I'm actually on the more pessimistic end in terms of the jobless growth type of issues. Not necessarily because in 20 years' time we won't be out of it, but what are we going to do for the next 10, 15, 20 years? What are we going to do with the 40-year-old unemployed steel worker in the Midwest in the US? We can't sort of start giving him social skills and all this sort of stuff, or indeed the person in the Chinese state-owned enterprise who has been thrown out of a job because, in fact, that is being automated and so on as well. And we're seeing that push, that flow coming right the way through, I think, certainly Southeast Asia, East Asia, and now probably eventually South Asia as well. So for the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think we're going to have this issue of displacement of basic labor by this new technology. I'm not now talking about use of the new technology in terms of the sorts of things that Sabina and Reinanna were talking about. I'm just talking about basic jobless growth. And I think that's going to be a real issue. And how we address this thing, if in fact one can't transfer income to these people through jobs, how is one going to transfer income? And this takes us back to broader systems of social protection and so on. So I've written about this, I can talk about this a lot, but let me just say that I'm at the more cautious end of the spectrum on this. I think we can't be too Pollyanna-ish about this. We have to really think about what the consequences are going to be over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years on this thing. The final point, which is sort of a real blue sky type point, Reinanna said, this is just coming at us, and that's true. It's a juggernaut coming at us, and we can't sort of be Canute-like and say, no, go back to the tide. Okay. But Tony Atkinson, in his book, the late Tony Atkinson, in his book, said, why should we take the pace of technology as given? Why should we take the nature of technology as given coming from outside? And he gives examples. We have in the past the Green Revolution, the internet itself. We have actually changed the course of technology through public investment, through public-private partnerships, and so on and so forth. So I think one should begin to think a little bit. I know everybody. Again, it's natural for economists to take these things as exogenous and then see what the consequences are. But what is the process that is generating these new technologies? And can they be made more basic labor friendly, both in terms of the creation of the new technologies, the new apps and so on, as well as, of course, the usages, which is what you, Hans, and Reinanna, and Sabina and Ishrat were also talking about in the examples that were being given. So I want to raise the question, raise the sort of blue sky question. Why should we take the pace of technical change, the nature of tech change as given? Since, in fact, over the last 50 years, several times, we have actually changed the course of technical progress. Thank you.
That's an important question. We have less than 2 minutes left. Time flies, which shows that it was really an exciting discussion. I have one final question, and I would like you to come with a one-sentence answer. The crisis is still not over at all. We are still full in the pandemic. There can be still shocks to the economy. What is the one surprise that we should anticipate going forward? Let me do it in reverse order now. Ravi, one surprise that we are not talking about, but perhaps we should.
I don't know that it's a surprise. I think it's completely predictable. 2 years from now, when this crisis has passed, we'll go back to our old ways. The new normal will be the same as the old normal. So we should, if we know that, then maybe we can prepare for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Israt.
Another crisis which we don't know, and we will be grappling with a crisis in our own ways. So the world is becoming more unpredictable, complex, and therefore our challenges are going to grow bigger than what we are facing in pandemic. That's my.
Thank you. Reinanna.
Yeah, I think the surprise really is going to be that this pandemic is not over, at least for South Asia, and I know for India, that we had thought, oh, well, by September we'll be back. Now we're saying by December we'll be back. I don't think that's going to happen. So it's a very unhappy surprise, but that's what's going to happen.
Sabina?
Redefine how committed we are and nationally in different countries to approach and really improve marginalized vulnerable groups. This will continue. Every couple of years, there'll be more webinars. If it's not webinars, seminars, because I agree with Ravi. It's just sort of, I don't expect much surprise. I would be surprised if there was an actual shift to and a commitment to addressing a much more socially just model in health and development in these sectors.
Thank you so much. We have reached the end of the panel. Thank you so much. I can't ask for a round of applause, but I'm really grateful that you shared your thoughts with us. Let me give for everybody who is listening, and thank you for all the people who participated. Let me give the round of applause to the panelists. Thank you so much, and I hope to soon interact again. Bye.
Bye.
Yes.